They closed their eyes and waited for the bullets. 17 Japanese nurses kneeling in the dirt outside a canvas tent in Texas, July 1945. The summer sun pressed down like a physical weight. Heat waves shimmered off the dry earth. Grasshoppers clicked in the scrub grass. The American flag above the medical compound snapped in the hot wind, each crack of fabric sounding like distant gunfire. The American doctors stood before them, holding a white cloth. Every woman knew what came next. They had been taught this since childhood. Blindfolds meant execution. First the cloth to cover your eyes, then the order to fire, then darkness, then nothing. Miyuki Tanaka, 19 years old former nursing student from Tokyo, made her peace. She had watched friends throw themselves off cliffs in Okinawa rather than surrender. She had heard the stories whispered in the caves passed from soldier to soldier, from nurse to nurse. American soldiers would violate Japanese women, torture them, kill them slowly. The blindfold was a mercy. At least she would not have to watch the rifles raised. At least she would not see the faces of the men who ended her life. She knelt in the front row, spine straight, chin raised. Around her, the other 16 nurses held the same rigid posture. Show no weakness. Show no fear. Die with dignity. This was the final lesson, the one that mattered most. But something was wrong. The American doctor's hands were shaking. Not from anger or excitement, from something else. Something Miyuki could not identify because it was not supposed to exist in an enemy. And when he spoke, his voice was not cruel. It was gentle, tired, almost sad. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything they believed about America, about their enemies, and about what it meant to survive a war. If stories like this one move you, please hit the like button and subscribe. These true accounts from World War II deserve to be remembered and shared. The choices made in that Texas hospital in the summer of 1945 would echo across decades, across generations, across the entire relationship between two nations. This is not just a war story. This is a story about what happens when we are forced to see what we cannot believe. Now let me tell you how 17 terrified young women and one heartbroken Texas medic came to this impossible moment. 3 weeks earlier, May 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The cave system had been their home for 2 months, though home was too kind a word. The Japanese Imperial Army had retreated underground as American forces advanced across the island. Field hospitals became holes in the ground. Operating rooms became spaces lit by candles and small fires. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of infected wounds and unwashed bodies and death. Miyuki and her 16 companions were members of the Himeuri Student Corps. They had been third-year nursing students before the war came to their schools. They had been learning anatomy and pharmacology and bedside manner. They had soft hands and clean uniforms and dreams of healing. The military had taken them, pressed them into service, given them 6 weeks of additional training, and sent them to the Philippines. They were told they were serving the emperor. They were told they were saving the lives of brave Japanese soldiers. They were told that this was their sacred duty. In the caves, they learned different truths. They learned how to amputate limbs without anesthesia while men screamed. They learned how to close wounds with whatever thread they could find. They learned how to tell which soldiers would survive the night and which ones needed to be given the grenades to end it themselves when the pain became too much. They learned that the emperor was far away and the Americans were very close, and survival was a minute-by-minute negotiation with chance. When the order came to prepare for the final stand, Miyuki had gathered the other nurses in the deepest part of the cave. Her voice was barely a whisper. We have 2 choices. We can take the grenades and go to the cliffs like the others, die honorably, or we can surrender. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Keiko spoke first. She was 18, fervent a believer. We cannot surrender. You know what they will do to us. Death is better. Death is honorable. But Amiko, only 17, the youngest among them, was crying quietly. I do not want to die. I am too afraid to die. Miyuki had looked at each face in the flickering candlelight. 16 young women, girls really, none of them older than 20, all of them terrified. I choose life, Miyuki said. I choose to surrender. Anyone who wants to die honorably, I understand. But I am choosing to live even if it means shame, even if it means whatever the Americans will do. In the end, all 17 chose life. They emerged from the caves with white strips of cloth tied to sticks. The sunlight was blinding after so long underground. The air was clean and it hurt to breathe. American soldiers surrounded them, rifles raised, shouting in English they could not understand. Miyuki raised her hands. The others followed. They knelt in the dirt and waited. The American soldiers did not shoot. They did not advance with bayonets. They called for a translator. They called for a medic, and that was the first moment when everything Miyuki had been taught began to crack. The prison ship from Manila to San Francisco took 3 weeks. They were kept in a cargo hold that had been hastily converted for human transport. Bunks bolted to the walls, a single bathroom, guards who watched them constantly but did not touch them. The food was the second crack in the certainty. Metal trays twice a day, rice, vegetables, sometimes meat, not large portions but regular, clean, prepared with care. More food than they had seen in months of cave living. Emiko cried the first time she ate, just sat with the tray in her lap and tears running down her face. Miyuki understood. It was not gratitude. It was confusion. Why would the enemy feed them? Why waste food on prisoners who were going to die anyway, unless they were not going to die? But that possibility was too dangerous to consider. Hana, 18 years old, feverish from an infected wound in her leg, whispered one night in the darkness of the hold. Maybe they are fattening us up, like cattle, make us healthy before they kill us. Or maybe, said a quiet voice from another bunk, maybe they are not going to kill us at all. No one responded. The thought was too large, too impossible, too terrifying in its implications. The ship docked in San Francisco in early June. They were processed through a military facility. Names recorded, medical examinations, photographs. They were given clean clothes. American military issue too large for their small frames, but clean. Actually clean. Then they were loaded onto trucks for transport inland. The journey across California and into Texas took 5 days. They saw America through the gaps in the canvas covering the truck bed. Highways, cars, buildings intact, people walking freely, cities that had not been bombed, fields of crops growing, abundance everywhere. This was the enemy nation, this place of wealth and order and untouched infrastructure. Japan was burning, cities reduced to ash, people starving, infrastructure destroyed, and America looked like the war had never touched it at all. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. July 10, 1945, the truck rolled through the gates of Camp Hood, Texas. Miyuki saw the guard towers first, then the barbed wire, then the rows of identical buildings and tents, then the American flag, enormous hanging limp in the still air. The heat was different than Philippines heat. Drier, harsher. The sun was white-hot overhead. The landscape was flat and brown and stretched forever. This was Texas, enemy territory, the heart of America. When the truck stopped, Miyuki was the first to stand. She had appointed herself leader through quiet assumption of responsibility. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to go first. It might as well be her. American soldiers opened the back of the truck. Young men, most of them, tan faces, tired eyes. They looked at the Japanese nurses with expressions Miyuki could not read. Not hatred exactly, not kindness, something more complicated. One soldier, red-haired with freckles across his nose, reached up to help the first woman down. Emiko flinched away from his hand like it was a snake. The soldier pulled back, confused. Then he simply stepped at it and gestured for them to climb down on their own. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Not the smell of death and jungle rot that had been their constant companion for months. This was different, sharp, chemical, clean, disinfectant, soap, laundry detergent, medical supplies, the scent of an actual hospital. Then came the sounds. English being spoken all around them but not shouted. Orders given in calm tones. Medical equipment being moved. Generators humming. Somewhere a radio played music. Actual music. Something upbeat and American that seemed obscene in a place of war. But this was not a place of war, Miyuki realized. This was a place of healing. A place where the war had already been won, and now the work was simply managing the aftermath. They were led into the largest tent in the medical compound. Inside, the temperature was cooler. Electric bulbs hung from the canvas ceiling powered by generators outside. The brightness hurt after so long in darkness. Medical equipment lined metal tables, bottles of clear liquid, bandages stacked in neat white piles, surgical instruments gleaming clean and sharp. A female nurse approached them, an American woman in a crisp white uniform, blonde hair pinned up under her cap. The Japanese nurses stared. They had never seen a Western woman this close before. She was tall, her skin was pale, her eyes were blue like colored glass. She smiled at them, a genuine smile. Not mocking, not cruel, just kind. The disconnect was staggering. Through an interpreter, they learned her name was Lieutenant Patricia O'Brien. She wanted to examine them, check for injuries. Nothing invasive, just basic medical assessment. The women looked at each other. This had to be a trick. But what choice did they have? Miyuki stepped forward first. If this was the prelude to violation or torture, she would face it standing. Lieutenant O'Brien was gentle, impossibly, bewilderingly gentle. She checked Miyuki's pulse. Her temperature looked in her eyes and ears with a small light. She asked questions through the interpreter. When did you last eat? Where does it hurt? Have you been wounded? The questions were clinical, professional, absent of any threat or mockery. When the nurse noticed the burns on Miyuki's arms, burns from a grenade explosion in the cave 3 weeks earlier, her face showed something that looked like genuine concern. She cleaned the wounds with careful hands, applied ointment that smelled like medicine and felt cool against the damaged skin, wrapped them in fresh white bandages. The whole time she spoke to Miyuki in English, her voice soft and reassuring, even though Miyuki could not understand the words. But tone mattered. Intent mattered. And this woman's intent seemed to be healing. One by one, each nurse was examined. The American medical staff found malnutrition, dehydration, untreated wounds, infections. Amiko had shrapnel embedded in her shoulder that had been there for 3 weeks. Hana had a fever from the infected cut on her leg. Another girl, Sachiko, had lost hearing in her left ear from constant explosions. The Americans moved efficiently, documenting injuries, preparing treatments. But there was something in how they worked that disturbed the Japanese nurses more than cruelty would have. They were being treated like patients, like people who mattered, like lives worth saving. This was not how you treated the enemy. Staff Sergeant James Hartley stood at the edge of the medical tent and watched the intake processing. He had been ordered to assist with wound care. His hands were skilled from 2 years working as a combat medic. Normandy Beach, the hedgerows of France, the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge. He had seen more blood and death than any 28-year-old should have to carry. And then the telegram. March 2nd, 1945. 3 sentences that ended his world. We regret to inform you. Your brother, Private Thomas Hartley. Killed in action, Iwo Jima. February 19th. Tommy, 22 years old. Marine. The baby brother who had looked up to Jim his whole life. Who had enlisted because Jim had enlisted. Who had died on a beach Jim had never heard of for an island that meant nothing to anyone back home. Jim had requested compassionate leave. They had offered him rotation stateside. He had refused. He wanted to keep fighting, wanted to kill Japanese, any Japanese, every Japanese, wanted to make them pay for Tommy. But the war in Europe was winding down. Germany had surrendered in May. Jim's unit was being reassigned. They asked him where he wanted to go. POW medical duty, he said. Japanese prisoners. The officer had looked at him carefully. You sure about that, Hartley? That kind of work, it can be hard on a man, especially if he has personal reasons. I'm sure, Jim said. So they sent him to Camp Hood, Texas, home, or close enough. Fredericksburg was only a few hours north. His parents were there. The family ranch, the life he had left behind when he enlisted in 1943. But he could not go home yet. Not until he had done this. Not until he had looked Japanese prisoners in the eye and made them understand what they had taken from him. He arrived at Camp Hood in June. 3 weeks of watching Japanese POWs being treated according to the Geneva Convention. 3 weeks of watching them fed and housed and given medical care. 3 weeks of rage building in his chest like water behind a dam. They did not deserve this. They deserve suffering. They deserve pain. Tommy had died eating K rations on a black sand beach, and these prisoners were getting 3 hot meals a day. And then the truck arrived with 17 nurses. Jim watched them climb down, young women in torn uniforms, thin, dirty, terrified, moving with the rigid control of people who expected to die. The first one who stepped down, the one who seemed to be their leader, looked directly at him for just a moment. Her eyes were dark and enormous in her thin face. She was maybe 19, Tommy's age when he enlisted. Something in Jim's chest twisted. No, she was the enemy. She was Japanese. Her people had killed his brother. He turned away and went back to work. Dr. Robert Morrison called Miyuki over to a corner of the tent where a surgical lamp stood on a wheeled stand. He was 42 years old, gray at the temples, with the calm competence of a man who had spent 20 years in medicine. He gestured for her to sit in the metal chair positioned beneath the light. Through the interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier who had appeared to help with translation, Dr. Morrison explained. Several of the nurses had eye injuries from the cave explosions. Debris and dust had damaged their corneas. They needed treatment, minor surgery in some cases, to prevent permanent damage. Miyuki sat. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone in the tent could hear it. Surgery meant they would put her to sleep, unconscious, vulnerable. This was when it would happen. Whatever horror they had planned, it would come now when she could not fight back. Dr. Morrison reached for a white cloth, clean, folded neatly. He held it up, showing it to her, explaining something in English. The translator put the doctor's words into Japanese. He says he needs to cover your eyes. The surgical light is very bright. It can damage your vision if you look directly at it. The cloth will protect your eyes while he works. Blindfold. The word crashed through Miyuki's mind like a wave. Every story she had heard, every warning from her teachers and military officers, every nightmare about American brutality came flooding back. Blindfolds meant execution. Everyone knew this. You blindfold the condemned before you shoot them. It was mercy for the executioner, not the victim. Easier to kill someone when you did not have to see their eyes. Miyuki's hands gripped the arms of the chair. Her breathing became shallow. She looked back at the other women waiting in the tent. They had seen the cloth. They knew. Emiko had gone pale. Hana was openly crying now, hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. Keiko had closed her eyes, her lips moving in what looked like prayer. Dr. Morrison saw her fear. He stopped the cloth still in his hands. He spoke again, his voice softer, and the translator relayed the words. He says you do not have to do this if you are afraid. But without treatment, you may lose vision in your right eye. The debris scratched your cornea. He can fix it, but he needs to protect your eyes from the light while he works. That is all the cloth is for. Protection from the light. Protection from the light. Not a blindfold for execution, a shield for surgery. The words made no sense to Miyuki. How could the same thing mean two completely opposite purposes? How could a blindfold be for mercy instead of for killing? She looked at Dr. Morrison's face. Really looked. He was waiting, patient, the cloth still in his hands. His eyes were steady, not cruel, not mocking, just tired and professional, and perhaps a little sad that she was so afraid of him. Across the tent, Jim Hartley watched this moment. He saw the terror in her face, saw her whole body shaking, saw her looking at that piece of white cloth like it was death itself. And he realized with a jolt that felt like electricity that she thought they were going to execute her. She thought the surgical preparation was a firing squad. His hatred wavered, just for a second, just long enough to feel something else underneath it, something that might have been horror or pity or recognition. She was terrified, the way he had been terrified before his first real combat, the way Tommy must have been terrified in the seconds before the machine gun found him. Fear was fear, no matter what uniform you wore. Miyuki took a breath, then another. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. If she was going to die, she would die doing her duty. She would be the first. She would show the others how to face it. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. The white cloth came toward her face. Every muscle in Miyuki's body tensed. This was it, the moment. Everything she had survived, everything she had endured had led to this white cloth in this Texas tent in this enemy doctor's hands. She closed her eyes, felt the soft fabric settle over them, felt it being tied gently at the back of her head, not tight, not painful, just secure enough to stay in place. She waited for the gunshot, waited for the blade, waited for whatever end they had planned. Instead, she heard a click, a hum, felt warmth on her face even through the cloth, the surgical lamp actually turning on. Dr. Morrison's voice giving quiet instructions to the nurse assisting him. Something cool being applied around her eye, probably a local anesthetic. He was actually going to operate, actually going to try to save her vision. The blindfold was exactly what he said it was. Protection from the light. Miyuki began to shake. Not from fear now, but from the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of it. She had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that she knew what was coming. The entire foundation of everything she had been taught was crumbling beneath her, even as the doctor worked carefully on her damaged eye. The procedure took 20 minutes. When it was done, Dr. Morrison removed the blindfold carefully. Miyuki's right eye was bandaged, but her left eye opened, and the first thing she saw was the American doctor's face. He was smiling, a professional smile, satisfaction at work done well. "Good," he said in terrible Japanese. "You will see. We'll heal. Good." A nurse helped her to a cot on the other side of the tent. Miyuki sat down. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Not from pain, from the sheer impossible weight of being wrong about everything. She watched as Dr. Morrison called the next woman forward. Emiko came, her face white with terror, her whole body trembling. She sat in the chair. The doctor showed her the cloth explained through the translator. Emiko nodded, unable to speak. When the blindfold was placed over her eyes, she made a small sound like a wounded animal. But she held still. The doctor worked. The surgical lamp hummed. 20 minutes later, Emiko was being helped to a cot beside Miyuki, her eyes bandaged, her hands still shaking, but her body still whole, still alive, still treated with care. One by one, each woman who needed the procedure went through the same experience. Each one expected death when the blindfold covered their eyes. Each one received medical treatment instead. Each one emerged alive, treated, bandaged, and more confused than they had ever been in their lives. Jim watched all of it, watched each nurse sit in that chair, watched their terror, watched their disbelief when they realized they were actually being healed. And something in him that had been hard and sharp since March began to soften at the edges. These were not monsters. These were just people. Young people, scared people, people who had been lied to about who Americans were, just like Americans had been lied to about who the Japanese were. Tommy had died fighting them. That was true. That would always be true. But treating these nurses with mercy, with basic human decency, with medical care they desperately needed, that was not betraying Tommy. Maybe Jim thought that was honoring him, proving that even in war, even with all the reasons for hatred, Americans could choose to be better than the war itself. By evening, all 17 nurses were resting on cots in a recovery area of the tent. They had been given clean hospital gowns to replace their torn uniforms. Their wounds had been treated. Those who needed surgery had received it. They had been given water, actual clean water, in metal cups, and told that food would come soon. They lay in their cots, some with bandaged eyes, some with bandaged arms or legs, all in a state of shock that had nothing to do with their physical injuries and everything to do with the complete collapse of everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Miyuki stared at the tent ceiling with her one unbandaged eye and felt the world shift beneath her, like the ground during an earthquake. The blindfold had been for protecting her eyes, not for killing her. POW, protecting. The word felt foreign in her mind, impossible to attach to Americans, to enemies, to the monsters she had been taught to fear. But here she was, alive, eye bandaged but healing, treated with a gentleness that made her want to weep. If they lied about this, she thought, what else did they lie about? The days began to follow a pattern. Morning came with light filtering through the canvas tents and the sounds of the hospital waking around them. American medics made rounds checking bandages, taking temperatures, asking questions through the translator. The routine was professional, efficient, completely ordinary. And that ordinariness was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Meals arrived 3 times a day, real meals. The first one came that evening, July 10th, carried on metal trays by American soldiers who moved with the casual efficiency of men performing a routine task. The nurses watched them approach with the same wary tension they had held since arrival. Nothing was certain, nothing was safe. Every kindness could be the setup for cruelty. But the food was real. Miyuki stared at her tray. The portions looked enormous. More food than she had seen on a single plate in 6 months. Steam rose from the scrambled eggs. The bacon strips were still glistening with fat. Toast actual bread with small packets of butter and strawberry jam. A metal cup of coffee black the bitter smell cutting through the antiseptic air of the medical tent. Around her, the other 16 nurses had received identical trays. No one moved. No one ate. They just stared. This was more food than they had been given in a week in the caves. This was more food than their families had in a month back home. The disconnect was staggering. Lieutenant O'Brien noticed their hesitation. She spoke to the translator, Sergeant Daniel Yamada, who had stayed to help with the evening meal. He was Japanese-American third generation, with a face that looked like home, but a uniform that marked him as something impossible. The nurses did not know what to make of him yet. The lieutenant says you should eat, Yamada translated. She says the food is safe. She says you need to regain your strength. Still no one moved. Miyuki looked down at the bacon. It was thick cut, not the thin strips she had seen in propaganda images of wasteful Americans. The edges were dark and crispy. The center was still a little pink. Fat pooled around it on the white plate. When she touched it with her fork, it was warm, almost hot. She had not eaten warm food in 4 months. The discipline that had kept her spine straight and her face expressionless began to crack. She picked up the bacon with her fingers, brought it to her mouth, bit down. The salt hit first, then the smoke flavor, then the fat, rich and overwhelming coating her tongue and throat. The texture was crispy on the outside, tender on the inside. It tasted like abundance, like a world where people could afford to eat meat for breakfast, like a country that had never known hunger. Tears came immediately, not from sadness, from the shock of flavor after months of bland rice gruel and cave water, from the realization that this was what the enemy ate. This was normal for them. This was just breakfast. Beside her, Emiko had picked up her toast. She held it like it was sacred, turning it over in her small hands. The bread was white, soft, factory-made. She spread the butter slowly, watching it melt into the warm surface. Then the jam, red, sweet, thick. When she took a bite, the combination of textures, soft bread and smooth jam, made her close her eyes. A small sound escaped her throat, almost like pain, but not pain, something else, something that had no name in Japanese. Gratitude mixed with guilt, pleasure mixed with shame, the taste of survival when you did not deserve it. Hana could not eat. She just stared at her tray hands in her lap, tears running silently down her face. "My mother is starving in Osaka," she whispered in Japanese. "And I am eating bacon in Texas. How is this possible?" No one had an answer. The scrambled eggs were made from powder but cooked with real butter. The yellow was bright, almost artificial looking, after so long eating gray food in darkness. Miyuki took a small bite. The texture was soft, slightly greasy, warm. It tasted like someone had cared about preparing it. Not thrown together as rations for prisoners, but actually cooked with attention. The coffee was bitter, American style, strong enough to make her grimace. Nothing like the green tea she had grown up with. But it was hot, actually hot, and caffeine flooded her system like a drug after months of exhaustion and cave darkness. She drank it slowly, feeling the heat travel down her throat and into her stomach. Feeling something like energy return to her limbs. Feeling her body remember what it was like to be fueled instead of just enduring. The toast with jam was almost too much. The sweetness was overwhelming. The strawberry flavor was so intense it made her teeth ache, but she could not stop eating. Her body was screaming for calories, for sugar, for fat, for anything that would rebuild what had been lost. Around the tent, the other nurses were going through similar experiences. Some ate slowly, carefully, afraid the food would make them sick after so long with so little. Some ate quickly, desperately, hands shaking as they brought fork to mouth. Some could only manage a few bites before the guilt became too crushing. Keiko, who had argued for honorable death in the caves, who had called surrender shameful, ate her entire meal in silence. When she finished, she set the tray down and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. She was crying but making no sound. The rigid control she had held for months was breaking. Food had done what fear could not. Across the tent, Jim Hartley stood near the medical supply station and watched them eat. He had been assigned to monitor the evening meal, make sure there were no medical emergencies, no allergic reactions, no problems with digestion after such long malnutrition. But what he saw was not medical. It was human. He saw young women crying over bacon and eggs. He saw them trembling as they drank coffee. He saw them struggling with the simple act of eating because it felt like betrayal. He thought of Tommy. His last letter had mentioned the food on Iwo Jima: K-rations, hardtack, canned meat that tasted like metal, water that tasted like chemicals. Tommy had joked about it, said when he got home, Mom better make her fried chicken and biscuits every single day for a year to make up for it. Tommy never made it home. And these Japanese nurses were eating better than American Marines had in combat. The anger surged again. Hot, sharp, familiar. But underneath it, something else. Something he did not want to feel. They were just kids. They did not look like soldiers. They looked like students. Like the girls who had worked at the soda fountain back in Fredericksburg. Like his younger cousins. They looked like people who had not chosen this war, but had been swallowed by it anyway. Jim turned away. He could not afford sympathy, could not afford to see them as human. That way lay confusion. That way lay betrayal of Tommy's memory. He left the tent and stood outside in the Texas evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. The heat was finally breaking. A slight breeze carried the smell of dust and creosote and distant rain that would not come. He needed to remember why he was here. Needed to hold on to the anger. It was all he had left of his brother. But the image of those crying women kept intruding. The way they had looked at that food like it was both salvation and damnation. Night came. The lights in the medical tent were dimmed but not extinguished. The generators hummed outside. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played low. Big band music. Glenn Miller, maybe. The sound of home. The 17 nurses lay in their cots, too exhausted to sleep, too confused to rest. They whispered to each other in Japanese voices, low so the American guards would not hear. Not that it mattered. The Americans did not understand Japanese, and the translator, Sergeant Yamada, had left hours ago. "This has to be a trick," Keiko said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. The crying had burned something out of her. "They are fattening us up, making us healthy before they kill us. Or maybe they want us to betray Japan, want us to become collaborators. The food is bait, but they gave us medicine," Emiko whispered. "Real medicine. Why waste it if we are going to die?" Propaganda, Keiko insisted. "They want us to think they are kind, want us to tell other Japanese prisoners, break our morale, make us weak." From her cot, Miyuki stared at the canvas ceiling and listened to the argument. It was the same argument they had been having since the caves. The same fear dressed in different words. But Miyuki was beginning to suspect something more dangerous than cruelty. She was beginning to suspect that the Americans actually meant what they appeared to mean, that the kindness was real, that they truly intended to heal and feed and care for their prisoners. And if that was true, then everything else was a lie. "I do not think it is propaganda," Hannah said quietly. She was still feverish, still weak, but her voice was steady. "I think they actually believe we deserve to be treated like this. Like we are people, not animals, not demons, just people." The silence that followed was heavy, because if the Americans saw them as people, that meant the Americans were people too. And if the Americans were people, then the propaganda about demons and monsters and subhuman enemies was false. And if that was false, then what else was false? The divine emperor, the sacred mission, the righteousness of their cause. The questions were too dangerous, the implications too vast. "I am too tired to think about this," Emiko said. "I am too tired to be afraid. I just want to sleep without wondering if I will wake up." "Me too," someone else whispered in the darkness. Miyuki said nothing, but she touched the bandage over her right eye, felt the gentle pressure, remembered the doctor's careful hands, remembered the moment she had been certain death was coming, and life arrived instead. That moment had changed something fundamental. She did not have words for it yet, did not have a framework to understand it, but she knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that she was not the same person who had knelt in the dirt that afternoon and expecting execution. The blindfold had been for protection, and that simple truth had torn a hole in everything she believed. Now she had to decide what would pour through that hole to fill the space left behind. Midnight. Jim Hartley walked through the medical compound on night watch. He had volunteered for the duty, told himself it was because he could not sleep anyway, but really it was because he needed to see them, needed to confirm they were real, needed to understand what he was feeling. The medical tent was quiet. Most of the nurses were asleep, finally exhausted by fear and food and the overwhelming strangeness of the day. But a few were still awake. He could see their eyes gleaming in the low light, watching, waiting. He walked slowly down the center aisle between the cots. His boots made soft sounds on the canvas floor. He kept his hands visible, non-threatening. Some of the sleeping women stirred as he passed. One whimpered in her sleep. Nightmare, probably. At the far end of the tent, he found Miyuki awake. She was sitting up on her cot, back against the metal frame, one eye bandaged, the other watching him approach. Her face was expressionless, that rigid Japanese control. But her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. Jim stopped a respectful distance away. They looked at each other across the space. Enemy and enemy, prisoner and guard. Two people on opposite sides of a war neither of them had started. He did not speak, did not know what he would say even if they shared a language. What do you say to someone whose people killed your brother? What do you say to someone who expects you to kill her? But Miyuki spoke, quiet, in Japanese. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was a question, simple, direct. He shook his head, gestured that he did not understand. She tried again, slower, pointing at herself, at him, at the tent, at the bandage over her eye, trying to ask something, trying to understand something. Jim felt helpless. Language was a wall between them, but then he remembered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small photo he carried. Tommy in his Marine uniform, dress blues, taken right before he shipped out. Big smile, confident, 22 years old and certain he would come home a hero. Jim held it out so Miyuki could see. She leaned forward slightly, looked at the photo, then up at Jim's face, back to the photo. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She reached slowly into the small bag of personal items they had been allowed to keep, pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothed it out, held it so Jim could see. A photograph, creased, worn. A young Japanese man in military uniform, maybe 20. Similar smile, similar confidence, similar certainty. Miyuki pointed at the photo, then at herself, said a word. Brother, the same word in any language. The same loss. Jim felt something crack in his chest, the armor he had built around his grief, the anger that had kept him functional. It cracked and something else bled through. She had lost a brother too. She understood. This enemy girl who he was supposed to hate understood the specific pain of surviving when your sibling did not. He nodded slowly, pointed at his photo, pointed at hers, said the word, brother. She nodded back. And for just a moment across the gulf of language and war and propaganda and hatred, two people who had lost brothers saw each other clearly, not as enemies, as survivors of the same grief. Jim carefully put his photo away. Miyuki did the same. They sat in silence for another moment. Then Jim stood and continued his rounds. But everything had shifted. He could not unsee what he had just seen, could not unfeel what he had just felt. Tommy was still dead. The war was still real. But the woman who had shown him that photograph was no longer just a Japanese prisoner. She was someone's sister, someone who knew loss, someone who was human. And that recognition was more dangerous than any weapon. Morning came with Texas sun and the sounds of the camp waking, July 11th, 1945. The second day, the nurses were given basic toiletries, toothbrushes, toothpaste, soap, combs, small luxuries that had been impossible in the caves. Keiko brushed her teeth for the first time in months and stood over the basin with the brush in her mouth and tears running down her face, overcome by something as simple as mint flavor and the feeling of clean teeth. They were allowed to shower. Hot water came from pipes the Americans had rigged up. The water pressure was strong, the temperature adjustable. After months of only cold cave water, it felt like a miracle. Amiko stood under the spray for 10 minutes the first time. Just stood there with her eyes closed, feeling the heat soak into her bones, feeling months of dirt and jungle grime and dried blood wash away. When she finally emerged, her skin was pink from scrubbing, and she looked younger than her 17 years. Almost like the schoolgirl she had been before war consumed her childhood. Clean clothes were provided. Not their old uniforms, but simple cotton dresses, American-made, too large but serviceable. They were allowed to wash their own clothes if they wanted. Soap and scrub boards were provided. Some of the nurses washed their nursing uniforms carefully, hanging them to dry in the Texas sun. Those uniforms were all they had left of who they had been. Morning rounds began. American medics moved through the tent, checking vitals, changing bandages, administering medication. The routine was professional, efficient, the same care given to each patient regardless of nationality. Dr. Morrison checked Miyuki's eye. The bandage came off carefully. He examined the cornea with his instruments and lights, made notes on a clipboard, spoke to Lieutenant O'Brien in low tones. Then he smiled at Miyuki. Healing well, he said, through Yamada, who had arrived for morning translation duty. No infection. Vision should be full in 2 weeks. Miyuki tried to say thank you. The English words felt strange in her mouth. Thank you. She had been taught to hate this language. But now it was the language of healing. Dr. Morrison nodded and moved to the next patient. Sergeant Yamada stayed. He looked at the 17 nurses with an expression that was hard to read. Sympathy. Understanding all of it mixed together, he spoke in Japanese. His accent was American, but the words were clear. I know you are confused. I know you do not understand why you are being treated like this. Let me explain something to you. In America, we have laws. The Geneva Convention. It says that prisoners of war must be treated humanely, must be given food, shelter, medical care, must be protected from harm. The Americans follow these laws because they believe law matter more than emotions. They believe even enemies have rights as human beings. This is not a trick. This is not propaganda. This is how America treats prisoners. All prisoners, German, Italian, Japanese. It does not matter. The law is the law. The nurses listened in silence, trying to absorb this concept, laws that protected enemies, rules that applied even in war. The idea was alien. In the Japanese military, there were no protections for those who surrendered. Surrender was shame. Shame was death. Death was preferable to dishonor. But here were the Americans saying survival was not shameful, saying prisoners had rights, saying laws mattered more than vengeance. Keiko spoke first. Her voice was challenging. You are Japanese. Why do you wear their uniform? Why do you fight for them? Yamada looked at her steadily. I am American. My parents were born in Japan, yes, but I was born in Los Angeles. America is my country. When America went to war, I went to war. Even though my family was put in internment camps, even though many Americans did not trust us because of our faces, I still fought. Because I am American. The concept made no sense to the nurses. Loyalty was blood. Loyalty was ancestry. How could someone choose a country over their own people? But Yamada was proof it was possible. He stood before them in American uniform, speaking Japanese words, explaining American values. A living bridge between two worlds. 2 days later, mail arrived. Red Cross delivery, letters from Japan. The postal system was shattered, but some mail still got through, filtered through neutral countries, taking months to travel. The American officers distributed the letters. Thin envelopes. Paper that felt like tissue, handwriting that looked like home. Miyuki received one. Her mother's writing. She recognized it immediately. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was dated March 1945. 4 months old. Written before her mother knew whether Miyuki was alive or dead. My daughter, the city is gone. The firebombing took everything. Our house, our neighborhood, everything we knew. We live in a shelter now. 9 families together in a space meant for one. Food is scarce. Your father works clearing rubble for a few grams of rice per day. He is so thin now I hardly recognize him. Your brother Hiroshi. We have heard nothing since his unit was sent to the Philippines. The army says missing. But we know what missing means. We have given up hope. We think of you every day. The school told us your unit was sent to Luzon. We heard the Americans invaded. We heard about the fighting. We do not know if you are alive. We pray you found an honorable death. We pray you did not suffer. If you are reading this, it means you survived. It means you chose surrender over honor. I do not know how I feel about that. I am too tired to feel anything anymore. But know that we love you, even in shame, even in dishonor. We love you. Be strong. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from. Your mother. Miyuki read the letter 3 times, each time the words cut deeper. We pray you found an honorable death. Her mother believed she was dead, had grieved for her already, had probably held funeral rites, had mourned both children, Hiroshi missing and presumed dead. Miyuki dead in honorable service to the emperor. But Miyuki was not dead. She was alive, in Texas, well-fed, clean, eyes healing, sleeping in a real bed, eating bacon for breakfast. While her mother starved in Tokyo ruins, the guilt was crushing, suffocating, worse than any wound. Around her, other nurses were reading their letters. Similar stories, cities destroyed, families starving, siblings dead or missing, everyone believing the nurses had died honorably in battle. And here they sat, alive, healthy, growing stronger every day. Emiko's letter was from her little sister. 10 years old, child's handwriting. Big sister, the teachers told us you are a hero. They said you died bravely for the emperor. I miss you so much. I am hungry all the time. Mother says we must be strong like you. I try to be brave, but it is hard. Yesterday we had rice with nothing. Tomorrow maybe nothing at all. I drew a picture of you. I keep it under my pillow. Are you watching from heaven? I hope heaven has food. Emiko read the letter and then could not speak for the rest of the day. Just sat holding the paper, reading it over and over, tears streaming silently down her face. Her little sister thought she was dead, thought she was in heaven, thought she was a hero. But she was here, eating 3 meals a day, while her sister went hungry. Jim saw them reading the letters, saw the devastation on their faces, asked Yamada what was wrong. Yamada explained, letters from home. Their families think they are dead. Their families are starving, and they feel guilty for being alive and well-fed. Jim thought about that, thought about the letters he had received from home after Tommy died. Letters from his parents, from Tommy's fiancée, from friends in Fredericksburg. Everyone sharing grief, everyone trying to make sense of the loss. At least Jim's family had food. At least America was not starving. At least his parents could mourn without also wondering where their next meal would come from. These nurses were caught in an impossible position. Alive when they should be dead. Fed when their families starved. Safe when their country burned. Survival was supposed to be a blessing. But for them, it felt like a curse. Jim watched Miyuki sitting on her cot, holding her letter, staring at nothing. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell her it was not her fault, that she did not choose this, that surviving was not shameful. But he did not have the words, did not share the language. And even if he did, what comfort could the enemy offer? So he just stood there, watching, bearing witness, feeling the weight of all the grief and guilt and impossible contradictions that war created, and feeling his own anger at these Japanese prisoners slowly transforming into something more complicated, something that included recognition and sympathy, and the terrible understanding that suffering was suffering regardless of what flag you served under. The days began to follow a pattern. And in that pattern, everything they believed about their enemies, about themselves, about what survival meant, would continue to crack and crumble and eventually shatter completely. The afternoon sun beat down on Camp Hood like a physical force. July heat in Texas was merciless, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned metal surfaces into brands. Inside the medical tent, the canvas provided shade but trapped the warmth. Electric fans turned lazily, pushing hot air from one side to the other. Jim found Miyuki sitting outside in a sliver of shade back against the tent pole, staring at the letter in her hands. 3 days had passed since the letters arrived. She had read hers maybe 100 times. Each reading seemed to take something out of her. He had been thinking about their midnight encounter, the photographs, the shared understanding of loss. He had been thinking about it more than he wanted to admit. Had been trying to reconcile that moment of connection with the anger he was supposed to feel. Tommy was still dead. That had not changed, would never change. But this girl holding her mother's letter, this enemy who was barely older than a child, she had not killed Tommy. She had been in a cave in the Philippines, terrified and starving, while Tommy died on a beach in Iwo Jima. They were both victims of the same machine. Differences, same suffering. Jim walked over slowly, sat down in the dust a few feet away, not too close, respectful distance. She looked up at him with her one unbandaged eye. The bandage would come off tomorrow. Dr. Morrison said the healing was perfect. Her vision would be fully restored. They sat in silence for a long time. The language barrier was still there, impenetrable. But silence could communicate too. Presence could communicate. The simple act of sitting beside someone in their grief. Finally, Jim spoke, in English, knowing she would not understand the words but hoping she might understand the intention. I lost my brother 5 months ago, February 19th, Iwo Jima. He was a Marine, 22 years old, had his whole life ahead of him. He paused, looked out at the flat Texas landscape, continued. I came here angry, wanted revenge, wanted to see Japanese prisoners suffer because was suffering, wanted someone to pay for what was taken from me. He turned to look at her. But you did not take anything from me. You were just trying to survive. Just like he was trying to survive. Just like we are all trying to survive this damn war. Miyuki did not understand the words, but she heard the tone, heard the pain underneath, heard something that sounded like confession or apology, or maybe both. She spoke in Japanese, knowing he would not understand but needing to say it anyway. My brother's name was Hiroshi. He was 20. He wanted to be a teacher. He liked poetry and baseball. He wrote me letters from training camp making jokes to keep me from worrying. The last letter I received was from January. He said his unit was being sent to the Philippines. He said he would write again soon. I never heard from him again. My mother's letter says he is missing. But missing means dead. We both know that. She held up the letter. My mother thinks I am dead too. Thinks I died honorably. But I am alive. And I do not know if she will be glad or ashamed when she learns the truth. They sat together, two people speaking different languages, about the same loss. The words did not matter. The understanding did. Sergeant Yamada appeared walking across the compound. When he saw them sitting together, he stopped, seemed to understand something was happening. Approached slowly. Do you need translation, he asked. Jim looked at Miyuki. She looked back. Something passed between them. Permission? Trust. Yes, Jim said. Please. So Yamada sat with them in the dust and became a bridge. Jim spoke and Yamada translated. Miyuki spoke and Yamada translated. And for the first time, they actually talked. Not as guard and prisoner, not as enemy and enemy, as two people trying to make sense of grief. Jim told her about Tommy, about growing up on a ranch in Fredericksburg, about teaching Tommy to ride horses when he was 6, about Tommy joining the Marines because Jim had to join the Army and little brothers always want to follow their older brothers, about the telegram that ended everything. Miyuki told him about Hiroshi, about growing up in Tokyo before the war, about Hiroshi teaching her to play shogi and letting her win sometimes, about both of them wanting to go to university, about the military taking him before he could finish school, about the silence after his last letter. They talked about what it felt like to survive when your sibling did not, about the guilt that came with every meal, every comfortable moment, every time you forgot to be sad, about how grief was not a single thing, but 1,000 small losses spread across every day. The sun moved across the sky. The heat began to break. They kept talking. At some point, other nurses drifted over, sat nearby, listening. Yamada translated for all of them. The conversation expanded. Became about more than just Jim and Miyuki. Lieutenant O'Brien joined them, bringing water and canteens. She sat cross-legged in the dust, her white uniform getting dirty, and pulled photographs from her wallet, showed them to the nurses. This is my family, she said through Yamada. My mother and father in Boston. My brother Sean, he is in Europe, fighting in France when we last heard. And this is Patrick, my baby brother. He is only 16, still in school. He wants to join up when he turns 18, but I pray the war ends before then. She looked at the nurses with sudden intensity. I have brothers too, she said. I understand what it means to worry, to wonder if they are safe, to fear the telegram that might come. The nurses stared at the photographs. A smiling Irish family in Boston. a world away from Tokyo or Osaka or Manila. But the same love, the same worry, the same humanity. Emiko spoke up, her voice small. I did not know Americans worried about their brothers. Lieutenant O'Brien smiled sadly. Of course we do. We are not so different. We all love our families. We all fear loss. We all want this war to be over so we can go home. The simplicity of that statement was devastating. They are not so different. The propaganda had made Americans into monsters, demons without families or feelings or human concerns. But here was this woman showing pictures of her brothers and admitting she was afraid for them. If Americans could fear and love and grieve, then Americans were human. And if Americans were human, then everything else was a lie. The cultural exchanges began almost by accident, small moments that accumulated into something larger. Keiko, who had been the most resistant, the most faithful to the old beliefs, was sitting in the shade one afternoon, trying to fold paper into shapes. Origami. She had asked for paper, and the Americans had given her old medical forms that had been discarded. She was folding them into cranes, the traditional symbol of hope and healing. Lieutenant O'Brien watched her work, fascinated, asked Yamada to ask if she could learn. Keiko looked suspicious at first. Why would the enemy want to learn Japanese arts? What was the trick? But O'Brien's interest seemed genuine. She sat down beside Keiko with the awkwardness of someone entering unfamiliar territory, smiled hopefully. Keiko hesitated, then began to teach. You fold like this, corner to corner, then reverse, then here. O'Brien's first attempts were clumsy. The angles were wrong, the creases uneven. Her large American hands struggled with the delicate precision required. She made 5 crooked cranes before getting one that looked almost right. Keiko found herself smiling, actually smiling, correcting the nurse's folds, showing her again, finding something peaceful in the simple act of teaching. By the end of the afternoon, O'Brien had a string of paper cranes, imperfect but earnest. She hung them from the tent ceiling near her workstation, pointed them out to other nurses and medics, explained that a Japanese prisoner had taught her, said it with pride, not shame. The cranes became a fixture in the medical tent, a small symbol of something bridging the gap. Art transcending war. 3 days later, Yamada brought a baseball. It was worn, the leather scuffed, the seams loose. A baseball that had seen use in dozens of games. He held it up for the nurses to see. Who wants to learn America's game? He asked in Japanese. The nurses looked at each other. Baseball. They had heard of it, some vague sport Americans played, but none had seen it played. None knew the rules. Come on, Yamada encouraged. Exercise is good for recovery. Dr. Morrison says you are all healing well. Time to get moving. Reluctantly, they followed him outside. The compound had a clearing that could serve as a makeshift field. Yamada divided them into 2 groups. Tried to explain the rules. Pitcher, batter, bases, outs, runs. It made no sense. The rules seemed arbitrary, the objective unclear. But Yamada was patient. Here you throw the ball. Try to get it past the batter. And you, Emiko, you hold this bat. Try to hit the ball when it comes. Emiko held the bat like it was a weapon she did not know how to use. Miyuki threw the ball. It went wide, nowhere near Emiko. Both girls looked embarrassed. Yamada laughed, not mocking, genuinely amused. It takes practice. Try again. They tried again and again. Slowly, gradually, they began to understand the mechanics. Ball, bat, contact, running. And then something unexpected happened. Emiko actually hit the ball. It was not a good hit, just a weak grounder that rolled a few feet. But she had made contact. She stood there, shocked bat still in her hands. Run, Yamada shouted. Run to first base. Emiko ran, awkward, stumbling, but running. And when she reached the makeshift first base marked by someone's cap in the dirt, she turned around with a huge smile on her face. The other nurses cheered. Actually cheered. In that moment, they were not prisoners, not enemies, just young women playing a game in the Texas sun. Jim watched from a distance. Watched them laughing and running and making mistakes and trying again. Watched the way exercise and fresh air and simple play brought something back to their faces that had been missing. Youth, grimdoi, the ability to exist without fear for a few minutes. Yamada waved him over. Come on, Hartley. Show them how it is done. Jim hesitated, then walked over, took the bat, showed them the proper stance, swung at Yamada's pitch, connected solidly. The ball sailed across the clearing. The nurses watched in awe. That easy American competence, that casual display of a skill learned in childhood and practiced to proficiency. Your turn, Jim said to Miyuki. Try it like this. He showed her the stance again. Hands here, feet here, eyes on the ball, swing level. She tried, missed, tried again, missed again. But on the third try, she made contact. A weak hit, but a hit. Jim grinned. Better. Keep practicing. And they did. For an hour they played baseball. Americans and Japanese. Guards and prisoners. Just people playing a game. The absurdity of it was not lost on anyone. A week ago, these nurses had expected execution. Now they were learning baseball. The disconnect was staggering. But in that disconnect, something was growing. Something that looked like the beginning of peace. The cowboy arrived on a Tuesday. Bill Crawford was 55 years old, weathered by decades of Texas sun and ranch work. He owned land near Killeen, raised cattle and horses, had lived his whole life in this part of Texas and knew every family for 50 miles. He had heard about the Japanese prisoners at Camp Hood, heard about the nurses being treated in the medical compound. And something about that had bothered him. Not in the way that made him angry, in the way that made him curious. He showed up at the gate one afternoon with 2 horses in a trailer, asked to speak to whoever was in charge, said he had an idea. Dr. Morrison came out to meet him. They talked for 20 minutes. Then Morrison called Jim over. Hartley, this is Bill Crawford. He runs a ranch near here. He wants to give some of the prisoners a riding lesson. Says every person should ride a horse at least once in their life. What do you think? Jim looked at the horses. Beautiful animals. A brown quarter horse with a white blaze. A gray mare with gentle eyes. Good ranch horses. Calm. Well-trained. Why, Jim asked. Crawford adjusted his hat, looked Jim in the eye. My daddy fought in the First War, against the Germans. Came home in 1919. Made friends with a German immigrant who had moved to Texas, a man named Otto Schmidt. They did not speak the same language at first, but they both knew horses, both knew cattle. They ran this ranch together for 30 years until Daddy passed in 1949. Crawford paused. War makes enemies. Peace makes neighbors. These girls are going to go back to Japan eventually. Maybe they will remember that some American in Texas taught them to ride a horse. Maybe that memory will mean something. Maybe it won't, but it cost me nothing to try. Morrison smiled. I like your thinking, Mr. Crawford. Let us ask them. The nurses were gathered. Yamada translated Crawford's offer. At first, they did not believe it. The American rancher wanted to teach them to ride for free, for no reason except kindness. It had to be a trick. But what kind of trick? What could he gain? Miyuki stepped forward. I will try, she said. Crawford grinned. Good. Come on over here. Meet Duke. He is about the gentlest horse in Texas. If he can tolerate my riding, he can tolerate anyone. Miyuki approached the brown horse slowly. Duke was enormous up close. Bigger than anything she had encountered in Japan. Horses were not common there. Most Japanese had never been near one. Duke lowered his head, snuffling at her with velvet nostrils. His breath was warm and grassy. His eyes were large and dark and surprisingly intelligent. Go ahead, Crawford said. Pet him, he won't bite. Miyuki reached out tentatively, touched Duke's neck. The coat was smooth and warm and alive. Muscle moving under skin, power restrained by gentleness. Crawford helped her up into the saddle. His hands were rough from ranch work, calloused, but careful. He adjusted the stirrups, showed her how to hold the reins. Just sit easy. Let him do the work. Duke knows what he is doing, even if you do not. Duke started walking, slow, gentle, responsive to Crawford's lead line. Miyuki gripped the saddle horn, terrified and exhilarated. The movement beneath her was unlike anything she had experienced. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the height, the sense of being carried by another living creature. Crawford walked beside her, keeping up a steady stream of calm conversation through Yamada's translation. You are doing fine, just relax. Feel how Duke moves. You move with him, not against him. There you go. That is better. They walked around the clearing. Once, twice, three times. And on the third circuit, Miyuki started to relax, started to feel the rhythm instead of fighting it, started to understand why people love this. The Texas landscape stretched out around them. Big sky, bigger than anything in Japan. Open land, flat horizon, a sense of space that felt like freedom. Crawford looked up at her. You are a natural. Most people tense up first time, but you are learning to trust the horse. That is the most important thing. When she finally climbed down, Miyuki's legs were shaky, but her face was radiant. Thank you, she said in careful English. Thank you, Crawford tipped his hat. My pleasure, miss. Anytime you want another lesson, you just let me know. One by one, other nurses tried. Some were terrified. Some loved it. All of them were changed by it, by the kindness of this old Texas rancher who gained nothing from teaching them except the satisfaction of sharing something he loved. As Amiko rode the gray mare around the clearing, laughing when the horse tossed her head, Crawford said something to Jim that stuck. War is about taking things away. Land, lives, hope. But peace is about giving things, skills, knowledge, respect. These girls will remember this. And when they go home and tell people about Americans, they will not only remember bombs and battles, they will remember that someone taught them to ride a horse, that someone showed them kindness when they did not have to. That is how you win a lasting peace, son. Not through more violence, through more humanity. Jim thought about Tommy, about revenge, about the anger he had carried for 5 months, and he realized it was lighter now. Not gone, would never be gone, but lighter, less consuming, less defining. Maybe Crawford was right. Maybe choosing mercy over vengeance was not betrayal. Maybe it was the only way forward. The barbecue happened on July 25th. Someone in Camp Command had decided morale needed boosting. Or maybe it was just Wednesday and Wednesdays were slow. Regardless, a pit was dug near the medical compound. Wood was gathered. A brisket was procured from supply. The smell started at dawn. Smoke and beef and spices. It drifted across the entire camp, making stomachs growl and mouths water. By midday, the anticipation was almost unbearable. The nurses had never smelled anything like it. Meat smoking for hours. The transformation of raw beef into something sublime through fire and time and patience. By evening it was ready. Jim brought plates to them, piled high with sliced brisket edges, charred almost black interior pink with a smoke ring, coleslaw on the side, cornbread glistening with butter, iced tea so sweet it made teeth ache. This is Texas barbecue, Jim said through Yamada. This is what home tastes like. Miyuki took a bite. The smoke flavor, the fat melting on her tongue, the tenderness of meat that had been cooking for 12 hours, the richness, the depth, the complexity. This was not survival food. This was celebration food. Food that said life is good, life is worth living, life is more than just not dying. The coleslaw was tangy and cool, perfect contrast to the rich meat. The cornbread was sweet and crumbly. The iced tea was ridiculous. Too sweet, too cold, too American, and it was all perfect. Emiko closed her eyes as she ate. Tears leaked out from under her lids. How can I go home after tasting this, she whispered in Japanese. How can I return to nothing when I have experienced abundance? Hana touched her arm. We must remember this. Remember that even in war there was kindness. Even from enemies there was generosity. We must carry this back with us. Tell people. Show them that hate is not the only option. Keiko said nothing, just ate slowly, deliberately, committing every taste to memory. Jim watched them savor the barbecue, watched their faces as they experienced something purely good after so much that had been purely terrible. And he thought about what Crawford had said. This was how you win peace, not through more death, through shared meals, through teaching someone to ride, through showing that your culture had beauty and generosity and was worth preserving, through proving you were human enough to see the humanity in your enemy. Tommy had died fighting. That was war. But these nurses would go home with stories of Americans who fed them and healed them and taught them baseball and let them ride horses. That was peace. Different kind of battle, different kind of victory. As the sun set over Camp Hood, 17 Japanese nurses and one Texas medic sat together eating barbecue. The war was still happening. Japan had not surrendered yet. The killing continued elsewhere. But in this small compound for this one evening, there was something else. Something that might be the seed of reconciliation. Something fragile and new and worth protecting. The blindfold moment had been the beginning, the realization that Americans were not demons. But this was the confirmation, the accumulation of small kindnesses into undeniable truth. The enemy was human, and that recognition changed everything.